South Asia has on various occasions been described as the most dangerous place on earth, primarily due to the nuclear-armed neighbours India and Pakistan. To add to this conundrum is the role of China, as a facilitator to the Pakistani position on international forums and also the recurrent tensions which it has with India on the vexed boundary issue. While many a strategic thinker have indicated that a China-India military conflict is unlikely based on geopolitical and geo-economic circumstances, there remains a perceptible chill in relations despite the Prime Minister's recent visit to China. In Pakistan, the democratic process has led to a new Prime Minister and a party which has previously not held power in the fractured state. This episode attempts to provide an updated view of these developments in the prism of the Indian challenges.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India Risk Report. And in this report, we are looking at the impact of Pakistan's ties with China on Pakistan's relations with India, as well as the fact that Pakistan has a new leadership in place, having gone through the process of a most controversial election. But more importantly, there is somebody else at the helm of affairs in Pakistan, and people who are in the know are of the view Pakistan's army would still continue to call the shots. But an equally important dimension which we miss out on our discussions regarding India and Pakistan is the China factor. China is looming large in Pakistan's calculations with its economic bailouts, its investments in Pakistan, and for decades-long military and nuclear assistance to Pakistan, and how the China-Pakistan combined would pose a threat to India and its future. We have two experts. We have Mr. Anuj Bhardwaj, former advisor to the Cabinet Secretariat, and a man who is well informed on a lot of issues, including some of the technical issues which would only come out in his utterances as he goes along. And we have Mr. Zorawar Singh, who is a senior foreign policy expert at the Center for Policy Research and also an author, most recently, of a book on China. So Zorawar, for me, it's always been the China factor that really defines many issues in the subcontinent. There are a lot of people who tend to look at things from a very narrow prism, which is that if the Prime Ministers of India and Pakistan shake hands, then they think the Kashmir issue would be resolved. And if they have dinner together, then they feel that we're going to have open borders forever. And if they start engaging with each other on every few monthly basis, then I think they feel also there would be, to go back to a Nehruvian remark, no need for having armies. Are we reading too much into India's assumptions? And is the fact that to what extent is China influencing Pakistan's behavior?
So firstly, I think the latest elections have shown that Pakistan and its army have truly arrived at some sort of a new equilibrium where they can shape domestic politics, give the veneer of a democracy, remain behind the scenes, have their favorite candidate prevail over what was a very popular leader in Punjab, toss him into jail. So you see this extraordinary turn of events. I don't think anybody expected this level of the result to play out. So today we are dealing with practically the old players back in charge, behind the scenes. How do you deal with that? So the China factor really comes in is that in this last 2 or 3 years, since 2015 particularly, the Chinese have made a big bet on Pakistan for geopolitical reasons. They saw India moving closer to the United States. They came out with a balance of power strategy, which was aimed at ensuring that Pakistan does not fall under the bus in these new changing alignments. Now, to some extent, they have succeeded in some of that, where the Indo-US relationship has not taken off to the extent that it possibly could have. The Indians have become more conscious of China's role in South Asia, and as a consequence, working to stabilize the relationship with the Chinese. Now, what has Pakistan got out of this? It's got $20 billion of Chinese money. Are those projects really going anywhere? Remains to be seen. But the real kicker, that what the Pakistanis had imagined, that China is going to be this bailout state where they're going to free ride for the next 20 years and transform themselves into this imaginary rising power, that is not going to play out. You do need a competent actors within Pakistan. They have not been able to do that. And I think also the Chinese are not stupid. They're not going to just pour in money into a loss-making bet. They are looking at Pakistan as a hedge and a signal to Washington and Delhi. As once that signal has gone and both sides, these other actors have recalibrated their geopolitical postures, the Chinese are going to look at the bigger game, and the bigger game involves dealing with a rising India. So we are seeing lots of twists and turns in this story. And
well, yeah, thanks for actually weaving the picture with great clarity, as I would see it. But Mr. Bhardwaj, what really is worrying to us in India, and both to the security fraternity, to businessmen, to the citizens, is that it appears now that with the mainstreaming of many former terrorists into Pakistan's political life, there is another new veneer of respectability that Pakistan's establishment, which is the military, the judiciary, and even the politicians, have given to terror groups. And Imran Khan doesn't seem averse to sleeping with them. Am I wrong?
You're absolutely correct. So the terrorists, which will now be operating not under the table but over the table, and it will be for all of us to see what they do in times to come. But more importantly, Imran Khan needs to set his house in order. Pakistan is in a big economic crisis. They have to get out of that. The only way out perhaps is going to IMF for another loan. So I feel that he has his job cut out.
Zorawar, China is again a factor that figures in the IMF loan related discourse. The Americans are saying that we don't want that loan to be given to Pakistan to actually pay off the debt to China, because China, whatever money it invests anywhere, whether it's in Pakistan, more recently in Sri Lanka, as has come to light, 6.4% interest or whatever that Sri Lanka couldn't bear to pay, and which led to Sri Lanka having to hive off the Hambantota port to the Chinese. The same is the story with the Chinese investment in Africa. And the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese has also run into problems in Central Asia and Malaysia and elsewhere, in Myanmar, because of the Chinese ruthlessness in enforcing economic rules, as it were. Now, where does China really need Pakistan, and to what extent would this investment of China, which is $50 to $60 billion, and Pakistan's become teary-eyed with gratitude when you talk about that, but really in Indian calculations it's small money. But the fact of the matter is that if it's $50 to $60 billion over a 10-year period, where all do you see that money going into Pakistan?
So the CPEC originally was precisely this number of 50, 60 billion, but it's the first phase has only seen about 20 billion so far already accomplished in or ongoing projects, mainly in the energy sector, power sector. The real kicker is going to be, if it were to play out in these special economic zones, industrial manufacturing industries, Chinese FDI coming into areas, because let's not forget one of the largest sources of Pakistan trade deficit is also with the Chinese. So can they circumvent that by the Chinese putting in more money seriously into this, which is not likely given the instability. Regarding the debt sustainability, if you look at the larger numbers, in fact Pakistan just released them, the irony is that the largest composition of its international debt is still owed to the Western development institutions, who've been frankly keeping Pakistan afloat for the last 60 years. They've had like dozens of bailouts even since the 1980 by the IMF. So China is in fact, contrary to our perception, not the player who will lose big if Pakistan sinks. The international Western institutions have a deeper stake because the balance sheets on theirs are much larger. So what I foresee is the IMF, which is the United States behind the scenes, and the Chinese are going to work out some sort of arrangement where they will keep this ball rolling. But the point is, do you solve the larger structural problem of Pakistan's domestic economy?
That's the question for Mr. Bhardwaj, that what do you think would be Imran's immediate priorities? Certainly not having a one-on-one with Mr. Modi, who's already in an election mode.
Well, he'll try to consolidate his position, firstly. And whatever he has said earlier, he may have to undo by actual actions. His closest ally is China as on date, and he has to maintain good relations with China. CPEC is China's pet project. He has to ensure that that project takes off, and his priorities are very clearly laid out.
So quite clearly, China is the big elephant in the room when you look at India's relations with Pakistan. Despite Pakistan having a new government which has come in after a controversial election, but more importantly, the actual players in Pakistan, the military establishment, will continue to hold the reins as far as the security dimension of India-Pakistan relations is concerned, and the military dimension has deep security ties with China and, interestingly, also with Washington. But more of that after a break. Welcome back. We are looking at India's relations with Pakistan, but the factor of China looms large when India deals with Pakistan, because China has extensive investments in Pakistan, but also because China sees that Pakistan could possibly be the game changer in China's relations with India. Zorawar, as far as China's investments in Pakistan are concerned, and what is not talked about very much is China has been looking at building 4 dams on the Indus River systems, which collectively over a period of time would produce something like 63,000 megawatts of electricity. That is perhaps more than the electricity that Pakistan produces elsewhere with all its other hydro projects. It is also not planning to give much of that electricity to Pakistan, if any at all. And if it does, would be at rates that Pakistan would find unacceptable. Imran Khan, therefore, in his election time, had made a mention that they need greater transparency on what the deal has been struck with the Chinese on the Belt and Road Initiative. Could you throw more light?
I don't see any interest within Pakistan, even from this new government. You look at the meeting with the Chinese ambassador and Imran Khan, you've seen sort of an interest in continuity in far as that. I don't think the Pakistan Army also wants to open up the books, because they have various economic actors, entities participating in these. So the real possibility for any kind of transparency for these projects will come in some sort of a deal if the IMF and the Chinese were to come together and sort of, so I think the IMF is suggested that let's say the Chinese write off some of them or delay some of these repayments. Now, that's
the IMF is asking for some very stringent conditions. Could you give us some of those?
So typically what the IMF does in terms of bailouts is, I mean, we faced one in the early 90s, is you liberalize the economy, lower your fiscal deficits, lower public spending, privatization, the classic neoliberal playbook. Now, in Pakistan, I don't know if that particular prescription will make a problem even worse, because I think what they are suffering from is, frankly, not having a capable bureaucracy, technocrats, political accountability. So it's a systemic ecosystem which is simply not in place, and it's not in place because for 60 years you've had an authoritarian structure stamping down rent seeking, and frankly a privileged political economy. To ask those same actors to reform a system where they draw benefit from is asking for too much. So it can happen, but for this, China and the United States have to come together on a common ground, and I don't see them competing and in the process putting Pakistan under the bus. I don't see that happening. I think Washington and Beijing have a vital, that's the irony, frankly, for India, that your so-called strategic partner and your strategic competitor have common ground on Pakistan's survival and longevity. So whether they can truly come and make those changes, maybe not, but they're not going to impose costs on Pakistan. And if they do not, then you're going to see the can being kicked down the road and these sort of sporadic punctuated cycles of stability, instability playing out. And whether this government lasts its full 5 years or it's a 2-3 year cycle before the army changes its bets, gets in new players, because what is the primary interest of the army is diffusing crises and preventing the system from completely falling apart, where it has to come into the forefront and impose martial rule, because that would be not in its interest. It's exposed directly to the people.
And that was a decision they took years ago.
Yes.
Several people in power, including General Mirza Aslam Beg, who succeeded Zia-ul-Haq, that the world prefers to have some kind of a democracy in place in Pakistan. And Mr. Bhardwaj, exactly the question I was coming to, that what is this obsession in India in trying to make Pakistan a mirror image of India and trying to make Pakistan a democracy, when the people of Pakistan repeatedly have always welcomed a coup, have never stood up against military dictators, barring aside an odd bunch here and there who were beaten to pulp. So the fact of the matter is that is the democratic model and the experiment that has worked in India, is that something that India is going to work harder to try and impress upon Pakistan, or should India be impressing upon Pakistan that any engagement with India would be on terms where we don't want to see terrorists in the driver's seat, where we don't want to see trade being scuttled even by small and medium enterprises, simply because there is this fear of the Indian economy completely sucking up the Pakistani economy. Where if you look at the model of China, China is a much bigger economy, but it still trades with India.
Well, Pakistan and India have also been trading, but not to the extent they should. They have a potential of increasing it tremendously, but somehow that's not working out. One-to-one, India, Pakistan are always together, but when it comes to collectively, somehow they don't seem to see eye to eye. Now, as far as democracy is concerned, it's a long drawn-out process, and unfortunately, Pakistan has got used to another way of functioning, and those who have taken power with coup d'etat and other means, they have been enjoying these perks for so long that they do not want to part away with that. So, having said that, you're not going to see much change as far as democratic processes are concerned, and India will never be Pakistan and Pakistan will never be India.
Well, Pakistanis would love to hear that. I don't know how many of Indians who still romanticize about what was the subcontinent before partition would be happy to hear that. But Zorawar, back to you. And this is another question which would have implications more for India than for Pakistan, and that is the trade war between China and the US. Both of them are big trading partners of India in as much as they are benefactors of Pakistan, right? But they will continue to keep investing in Pakistan because of their own strategic rationales, which are many, and many of them are contestable. But when it comes to being at a trade war, the Chinese and the US governments are going to put, the US in particular, as we've seen in the case of Iran and Russia, are going to put a lot of restrictions on India, which will obviously make India consider alternate routes, because we can't let the growth engine slow down. What's your take?
Absolutely. So, I think the question that's being asked and debated is the Trump administration's approach to China a part of a larger reorientation towards the global economy? It is. It is trying to cut back and renegotiate and rebargain across multiple states, including its own allies. So, frankly, I don't see how India in any way is going to get exceptions in this process. It will have to bear the costs of that. Fortunately, we don't have that extent of trading links with the United States for us to pay costs in that particular facet. But a breakdown of the multilateral trading system and these strategic bilateral deals is something that we'll have to adjust towards. What's happening between the United States and China is not so much a trade war to improve jobs in America. This is a larger strategic competition that's happening, where the United States is trying to slow down the growth of certain key sectors in China's high-tech economy, which they have these grand plans of 10 years to do Make in China. And you've seen even export controls now being proposed from the United States. So that's a much bigger game plan being played between them. Can India benefit from that particular trade friction? Maybe in some handful of primary sectors, agriculture, soybeans, for example, we've seen that. The real kicker possibly could be where some of these supply chains that get disrupted with China's participation start looking for new areas or new countries to plug in. Now, will India be able to fulfill or step up? It looking a little iffy at times, because we've seen most of the players who've benefited from China moving away from some of the lower end parts of the value chain have been countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Thailand, Southeast Asia. India has not benefited from those, partly because of problems in our own ecosystem, manufacturing, labor laws, etc. But if we can step up, we might find an opportunity where there are international investors who might want to see some industries being located to India as China's exports start facing higher costs into Western markets.
Okay, great. So that was the big picture about the trade war between the US and Pakistan, US and China. But about Pakistan, short question, quick answer. It is argued that a stable Pakistan is in India's interests. But the military establishment, which claims they have more of Pakistan's interests in mind than India's, they do not encourage stability by getting into close relationships with trouble creators like terror groups. So is a stable Pakistan in India's interest, or a partially unstable Pakistan in India's interest?
A stable adversary is always beneficial. So I will say that a stable Pakistan and the government there will augur well for India.
Augur well for India?
Yes, a stable
how would you argue that for a bit longer?
That will give us time to consolidate.
But do you mean that if we have a stable Pakistan, there will be no firing on the LOC, there will be no terror attacks? In the last 1 year itself, or better part of this year, that more than 55 Indian soldiers of all types have been killed or heavily wounded for firing across the LOC. And tell me a time in history when there were less tensions on the border.
Border tensions, border problems is an entirely different ball game, and that's going to continue, because historically India and Pakistan are going to be fighting and will continue fiking.
So you are basically
stability is in the sense that they will not be they will not press the nuclear button.
Well, I'd like to take that argument a little forward, but I don't know if you're aware that in the 80s, when the brass tax crisis took place, a study was carried out by Stimson Center in America, and they had military advisors of both India, Pakistan, and ambassadors to both countries, and many other academics as part of the study. It's available with Stimson Center. And what really emerged, that in the event of a standoff, even like brass tacks, and which requires a lot of levels of deployments to take place, there was a reluctance on the part of the Pakistani military to consider seriously the nuclear option. So when we talk about the fact that if a little bit of escalation take place, Pakistan is going to blow us up, I don't think we are giving them their due in terms of their rational decision making. The military, I believe, in Pakistan is a very rational entity. It's the politicians in Pakistan that we need to watch carefully and not take their utterances so seriously that it leads us into a sense of panic or into a sense of lull. That's my take, because I personally believe that an unstable Pakistan is better for us, because they will continue to look after their own backsides instead of worrying so much about how to trouble India. But a lot of good inputs from you, Zorawar, and thank you very much, Mr. Bhardwaj. But I think this is a space we need to watch. Till our next episode, goodbye.